But I think operationally, the constabulary will always take the lead on actually addressing any particular incidents. I think the other thing it's probably worth commenting on is the department actually went out for some consultation a couple of months ago regarding the sorts of priorities that the public on the Isle of Man think that the police should be focusing on. We've had that feedback back, and we hope to be responding or to publish shortly the output of that. But unsurprisingly, that combination of potential youth offending, I suppose at its lowest level antisocial behaviour, which I recognise is still a concern for people. But I think we understand that that is something that people are concerned about, and it will continue to remain a focus for the police.
Is it what we used to call vandalism, or how does it manifest itself?
I think it varies, doesn't it? You see pockets, certainly from what we see, you see pockets of different activity. Unfortunately, a little earlier in the year, we had a series of children taking vehicles without consent, which is, for my money, beyond antisocial behaviour, and that has been actioned very firmly by the constabulary, and also that sort of thing will also go through the justice system.
Jan Davies, anything to add on that?
I think what's really interesting is how social media influences these behaviours, and I think it was something that was spoken to in the interview you had with one of the community police officers, Lou Kenyuk, earlier on. But young people do start seeing things on social media, and then they share things, and it's something really that has contributed to this, and it's something else the police need to deal with, to be vigilant around and to monitor social media and to try and get to the heart of this kind of offending behaviour, which, as the minister says, in communities it is a priority for people. And although it's talked about as low level, it is something that influences the way people perceive their community and affects their quality of life. So it is something the police take very seriously.
But we're a rural community, Dan. I mean, imitating urban tropes and urban behaviours, is that down to social media?
I think to some extent.
I mean, like stealing cars.
Yeah, it's something we're not used to, is it, here? And it is something which is proliferating in certain areas, and the police have responded to it. But I think the department's role in this is making sure the police have sufficient tools to deal with the issue, and also those sentencing where it gets to serious enough to warrant sentencing, that the magistrates and the courts have sufficient tools at their disposal to put sentences or resolutions in place that support the community, but also try and reduce the offending behaviour in future. And
Jane Poole-Wilson, 20 years ago, no chief constable would have said we need resources to monitor social media. Does the constabulary actively monitor social media now?
I think the constabulary recognises, for the reasons that Dan has touched on, but I think more broadly, unfortunately, what we saw in the UK in recent weeks and the part that social media played in that, I think the constabulary recognises that social media is a part of what can feed into potential harms and criminality. And so, again, for our island, it all has to be done on a proportionate basis, bearing in mind the resources that the constabulary has. But if that's a sensible way for them operationally to consider the types of risk and things that could happen, and then to try and either preempt that, but also to address it, then that is probably a sensible use of their resource.
We talked previously, I know on occasions you've been, and we've talked about where crime starts and where criminal behaviour and criminal behaviour pattern starts, and the fact that it's one end of a nexus that can end in prison and a ruined life. What would you say to parents and guardians who are having issues at the moment and finding children, people they're responsible for in their family or in their circle, that are being drawn towards bad company, as it were? I'll put it politely.
So I empathise hugely. I mean, I've got teenage sons myself, and I think it's a mistake to think that people are immune, families are immune from potential this type of potential problem. I think obviously parenting is a personal matter, and parents will take the action they think is appropriate. But certainly from the constabulary's perspective, the police early action team is very willing to get involved and help and support families and parents with trying to raise awareness of children that what they might perceive to be a bit of a laugh, a bit of fun, no real consequence, actually they do need to understand there are consequences. They put themselves at risk very often. They also put other members of the community at risk and affect people's quality of life. But if it becomes serious enough to go through the criminal justice system, convictions result that then really can have an impact on a child's life. And so the police early action team is a good source, I think, of supporting families and young people to realise the consequences of what they may.
Dan?
Generally, the first stage of a police intervention is a letter under what's called the link scheme. And so that letter home goes to parents advising them that their child has come to the police's attention. And in the majority of cases, that letter home is enough to start a conversation between the child and the parents, because often the parents aren't even aware that this is going on. So it's a really useful intervention tool that allows the police to raise the issue and to start those conversations between the parent or carer and the young person.
Okay, let's get to the lines now, and we got Howard with us. Hi, Howard. You're live with Jane Poole-Wilson and Dan Davies.
Good afternoon, Andy, and to your guests, Jane and Dan. Just a thing that came up the other day. It was a Saturday and the Mail on Saturday, and it's something you don't really think about. There was a cycle race in Wales, and well, we've heard the publicity about this all over. Wales has more or less an overall speed limit of 20 miles an hour. But there's something I didn't realise, and I looked it up on the internet. Bicycles are not restricted, and they can exceed speed limits, or the riders can. So in this instance, I don't know whether they had a rolling road closing, or it was just an open road. But they had to reroute the race because the support cars would be breaking the law if they followed the cycles who were exceeding 20 miles an hour. The cars were unable to because they'd be in breach of the law. Now, I looked it up on the internet, and on the Isle of Man, the same thing applies. Cyclists cannot be prosecuted for exceeding the speed limit. Now, we have a lot of electric bikes coming in now, electric scooters, and even some of the motorized mobility things. But is there any progress, or has anything been suggested about speed limits for cycles on the Isle of Man?
Okay, all right, Jane Poole-Wilson.
So thanks, Howard. Good afternoon. Thanks for your question. I think it's interesting what you've raised in Wales, and I'm not actually familiar with that situation. I think on the Isle of Man, our road traffic legislation and the rules we have around different types of vehicles and cycles and so on, that's all owned and governed by the Department for Infrastructure. And I'm just searching back in my mind, actually, from memory, because it was updated, I think, in around 2016, 17, something like that. And I seem to recall there was a report done at the time looking at a number of aspects of that updating of the legislation. But off the top of my head, I cannot remember, Howard, whether what any particular proposals were around cycling, so I would have to go and check that. But that's something that's worth following up with the Department for Infrastructure, I think, in terms of what the current rules are in the Isle of Man.
Okay, and Dan Davies, you're a keen cyclist.
I am indeed, and I follow the rules of the road. I think the question is really interesting, but it's about harm ultimately. And the question is that where a car exceeds the speed limit, and, there's loads of studies been shown, haven't they, that, a car travelling at 30 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour that hits a pedestrian, the impact on the pedestrian is likely to be significant. Whereas where a cyclist hits a pedestrian, because of it's a far lower weight, the impact and on the pedestrian in most cases is likely to be less significant. So it's about how you focus resources on where the harm is. But as the Minister said, I think the Road Traffic Act was amended about 4 or 5 years ago to include some offences where the scope would extend to cyclists. Like, I think dangerous driving was potentially one of them. I can't remember.
Is there such an offence as dangerous cycling?
I think furious cycling is the actual is one of the offences. And
because we do have some very steep hills on the Isle of Man.
We do, absolutely.
So, and as you say, if a cyclist clouts into somebody, as you say, it's not like a truck hitting them, but it's not inconsiderable, is it?
No, but then you have to ask where the pedestrians are. So the pedestrians are unlikely to be on Ingerbreck or Druidale, but they are likely to be in towns and villages. So then you go back to that question of harm. Is a cyclist going through a pedestrianised area at, say, 25 miles an hour likely to cause more harm to a pedestrian than a car going 5 or 6 miles an hour over the speed limit? That's the question of balance, really, isn't it?
Okay, final word, Howard.
Yeah, it's just that where I'm living, as you know, is up in Annacore, and we have a pedestrianised area all around the centre of the estate. And on numerous occasions, your heart is in your mouth when you're out in the front of the house, where a lot of the cyclists, and these are adults, I'm not talking about the children. Children could be oblivious to this, but adults should be more cautious. And they're certainly exceeding what we have here as a 20 mile an hour speed limit on the estate. But also, as Dan's just said, up in not Annika, up at Baldwin and places like that, but you haven't heard of any prosecutions or otherwise of people cycling through Strand Street. And there's people going through there on electric scooters now, and they're exceeding, well, they're breaking the law because, first part, they're not allowed in Strand Street certain times of the day, and other times the speed is far in excess of what considered safe.
Okay, all right. And obviously, Dan, we're being encouraged for active travel to take to our bicycles. So this is something that's going to increase.
I think so. So just on the point to electric bikes and electric scooters, they should be limited to 25 kilometres an hour, which is about 16 miles an hour. And if people are going beyond those speed limits, then it's illegal and they should have insurance and a helmet. So that's a matter for the constabulary. And back to Howard's point about people cycling through Annika who he feels are breaking the speed limit, then absolutely speak to the constabulary. In the same way any road user should be reported. If people have a concern about speeding in their neighbourhood, then speak to the constabulary, raise it as a concern. And I'm sure that the neighbourhood teams there, who do an awesome job in the communities and neighbourhoods, particularly around Douglas, should go and they should speak to their community police officer, who can then go and look about what enforcement might be needed.
Okay, Julian's next with us. Hi, Julian. You're with the Justice and Home Affairs team.
Hi, Andy. Welcome back. And hello to Jane and Dan.
Hi, Julian.
Hello.
Hiya. I've got a couple of quick questions, so I'll get straight to it. First one for Jane. The hate speech law that's currently going through and being drafted here, can you define exactly what hatred is so that people will know what the bill is trying to prohibit?
Julian, thanks for your question. I know usually when I'm on, you ring up and ask about this theme. Can I just be clear that while we do have a hate crime law on our long list of legislation, the Department of Home Affairs has actually a significant amount of legislation it's trying to progress at the moment. And so there is no drafting underway for this bill because we are working in priority order. As you'll know, we've implemented domestic abuse and sexual offences. We've got justice reform work to do. We're working on developing a consultation on updating our firearms legislation. We're working on developing a consultation on updating our fire safety and fire services law, which needs modernising. We're working on a national infrastructure security bill. So I hope just from that brief list, never mind the secondary legislation we're working on, it gives you a flavour of the work that we are developing consultations on and or drafting instructions, and those are taking priority. So there is nothing I can say at the moment, Julian, in terms of the scope of the bill, the scope of any consultation, because it is not, it's behind all of those other pieces of legislation that we're working on first.
Okay, next question.
All right, I'll get to the second one. At the Low Carbon Conference in the Comus Hotel in 22, in your opening speech, you said, and I quote, "We need to address the impact of climate change." And so in the 2021, the Climate Change Act was signed into law to address what is described as the climate emergency. Can you say when we will know when the climate emergency is over and what the parameters will be to make that decision to stop the emergency?
Well, I don't know that anybody can speak around that other than people who are qualified scientifically. And I do know that one of the predominant efforts that people were focused on was trying to keep the extent of global warming to 1.5 degrees or less. I think from the Isle of Man's perspective, as a responsible jurisdiction, I think it's important that we do play our part. I think practically for the island, and I recognise we're going outside Home Affairs now, but I think practically for the island, our energy infrastructure is due for renewal. And I think taking full account of matters like energy security and our resilience, as well as doing the right thing for the planet, is part of what we should be focusing on. And so I think it's about acting in the island's interests as well as the planet's interests.
Okay, all right.
Sorry, I'll just finish very quick. Because it was a low carbon, and my understanding is that they want to take the carbon content of the world down. Does that mean that we're going back to the Industrial Revolution times, in which case you had the Great Famine in Ireland, another one in Scotland, Portugal, Spain, etc.? If we're going to start reversing CO2 levels back to the Industrial Revolution, there was pretty bad weather, even on the Isle of Man, and multiple floods in Laxey, etc. Is this really a good idea?
Well, I think looking out the window here at Douglas Head, that we've had absolutely shocking weather, haven't we, over the last week or so? And I think the question, to my mind, is there are, with change and doing what we can to reduce the harmful impacts of change, we also can be looking at opportunities. And I think there are lots of opportunities for this island in terms of its future, potentially new economic sectors. I mean, I know there's a lot of research and work going into vertical farming. And I think there are lots of things that the island can look at and determine what are the things that support our future economic and social success, as well as playing our part as a responsible nation across the planet.
Okay.
I think,
sorry.
I think, the department in any event is a huge net user of carbon in regardless of your views on climate change itself. The department spends a lot of money each year on heating the prison, lighting the prison, on the 24-hour services that we provide. So we're taking steps to reduce the impact of our carbon use, but it has a practical impact that we will save money. So we're going to look to put, we're going to decarbonise the prison entirely. We've got a plan to do that by 2036.
Is that solar panels?
It's solar panels, it's air source heat pumps, it's LED lighting, and that will have a benefit to the department in we're not spending money on energy costs, so we can reinvest that into frontline services.
Okay.
Listeners, Andy, just to add to that, listeners may be interested that the mast that we're responsible for at Carnane has been operating with solar panels now for the best part of, I think, 18 months to 2 years. Yeah. Okay. And we already know that it powers itself on occasions, thankfully, when the sun does shine.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Julian.
Thanks very much.
All
Cheers.
right. Good to hear from you. David's with us now. Hi, David. You're with the Home Affairs and Justice team.
Hi, Andy. Can I just ask the panel just for updates on things? Probably one's been knocked off for what the Minister said. What's the update on NPR, which would be a good tool to help the police and other agencies?
Okay. Automatic number plate recognition?
Yes. Hi, David. I answered a question on this in the Keys, I think, a couple of months ago. But basically, there are a number of actions we've got underway to make sure that we can have the use of ANPR, particularly at the ports in the first instance.
Have we got it at the moment? Because it seems to come and go.
So again, because the Department for Infrastructure has some jurisdiction in this space when it comes to roads policy per se, the Department for Infrastructure does have certain powers, but when we're talking about criminality and law enforcement, it comes back to Home Affairs. And so what we want to do is, under the relevant legislation, bring in our own regulations and order that we have to do under the relevant, it's the Road Traffic Legislation Act. I can't remember the detail now, but it's a relevant piece of legislation that means Home Affairs has its own ability to introduce ANPR for the purposes of law enforcement. Okay,
and will that be the constabulary can roll it out as and when they want?
Operationally, it will be a matter for them, but the primary focus to begin with is at the ports, because we recognise that an intelligence-led approach to stopping criminality moving so readily through our ports is an important one.
And they can roll it out within the framework that's set by the Department of Home Affairs, which governs how they use it, how they use the information they collect, and for what purposes.
Okay, David?
Christmas is coming. But anyway, can I ask you the question too? Is when was the last time the Eastern Neighbourhood team met? Who did they meet with? And what was their agenda? And you can come back on it later in the day. But we just had a load of vehicles picked up by the contractors with no tax, no insurance, illegal on the Isle of Man. Surely the NPR would pick that up a lot quicker than sending out massive loads of staff and picking people up with vehicles and impounding them. And the final thing, Andy, if I can, I'll back off, is what's happening with community service, where community service, people get hours, they've done something minor, can do something for the community and see some benefit. What's happening with it?
Okay. First of all, ANPR and vehicles being seized.
Yeah, so David, I think that is one where there is crossover with the Department for Infrastructure and how they can use ANPR to do some of that monitoring about vehicle licensing and so on. And it is a useful enforcement tool. So, but I also know from some of the correspondence I see that people are pretty active at reporting untaxed vehicles and so on to the constabulary, and the constabulary will follow up on that when that's reported.
Okay, and community service, what part does it play in rehabilitation?
Community services, it's a really fundamental part of rehabilitation, actually, and it allows people to be seen to be repaying their debt to the community in which they offended. I think we have had a few operational issues lately with community service due to a number of staffing issues, but we're looking to resolve that at the moment, and we will get that back up to full strength shortly. But there are community services sentences available. They are being used, and we've seen some great examples over the past 6 to 12 months on social media of people. The garden at Site Matters, for example, I think some commissioners in Braddon, I think, had benefited from that. The garden in St John's, where the old Farmers Arms or the Central used to be, those who recollect that has been handed over to the community service department in the probation service, and that will be used for people to do community service in. So it's just a question of resourcing it. It's quite awkward because people often only have time to do community service at the weekend, and if you're trying to get somebody on a contract to come and work, say, 12 hours over a weekend to supervise the people doing community service.
So they have to be supervised.
Absolutely.
They can't be left to their own devices just to say go and clean the path.
No, they have to be supervised, and obviously it's a risk assessment process for the probation service. So it's quite a difficult role to fill, but we are looking at ways to fill that over the next 6 months.
Okay. Jane Poole-Wilson, MHK, the Justice and Home Affairs Minister, and her Chief Officer, Dan Davies, on Mannin Line till 1.
It's time to start enjoying the garden. And from barbecues to garden furniture and machinery, tools and plants, Riley's Garden Centre has everything you need. Call Road Braddon and rileys.co.im or follow them on Facebook or Instagram.
Quadlock is the strongest and most secure mounting system in the world for integrating your phone, camera or accessories into your outdoor pursuits and for your car, van or motorhome. See the Quadlock display at H&H Motorcycles in South Key, Douglas.
Oil-fired boilers installed by Manx Petroleum keep homemakers happy and businesses a better place to be. If your current boiler is over 10 years old, you're missing out on better economy and efficiency. That's because today's oil-fired boilers from Manx Petroleum are the best they've ever been. From semi-detached dwellers to office occupants, our boilers and tank installations come with interest-free finance. Visit mp.im. Manx Petroleum, always here for you.
People of the Isle of Man, are you thinking of buying or selling a home? Well, wait! You need to talk to the conveyancing team at LVW Law. LVW Law! They've over 20 years of experience and know what they're talking about. They're friendly and efficient. Do not buy or sell a property without calling LVW Law on 836757. For a no-obligation quote, LVW Law.
The Sunday Chill Out.
Hi, this is Chris Pearson from the Chill Out Show. On Sunday 22nd September, we'll be marking the end of summer with a live outside broadcast from the Cafe at the Sound between 6 and 9. Why not come and join us for some fantastic sunset views over the Calf for the autumn equinox? With drinks and chilled out tunes, the night is free, but we'll be raising cash for the I'll Listen charity. The Chill Out Show live from the Cafe at the Sound from 6 on Sunday 22nd September.
Looking to the sea.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
And let's get to the lines. Here's Eddie with us. Eddie, hi, you're live with Jane Poole-Wilson and Dan Davies.
How you doing? All right.
Good, thanks. Yeah.
I've got a good question, I think, but it's in two parts, if I may. So if you would come back to me after the first bit. I heard you talking to Julian about, changing legislation, and my question is really, when you get to change legislation, is there a set time to go through all the procedure of changing legislation, or does it have to go through the government, MHKs and so forth, or does it have to go through to the public even?
Okay, quick. So an existential question, Jane Poole.
No, I think it's a really good question, Eddie, actually. There isn't a fixed time, as it were, because it will very often depend on the legislation itself. So, you do end up with sometimes very short bills. For example, people may remember that just before Christmas, we brought through a gas bill that was to create a power to prevent vulnerable people being cut off. And that was a very short bill. And actually, we truncated it deliberately through the process because it was very targeted and short. But I would say for most legislation, the process is that you need to think about, why are we changing the legislation? So what's the problem we're trying to fix? Or sometimes it's our legislation's got out of date, and our sexual offences legislation is a good example of that. So things have progressed and we have got some legislation, but it's just not fit for purpose anymore. So what's your problem? And then what should we do to fix it? And that's where the consultation comes in. So at that point, sometimes we might go out and consult on the ideas and the ways in which we could fix it. And I mentioned when I was talking to Julian that we want to, for example, update our firearms law. So what we will do is, before we even write any new law, we will go out and say, here's where we think we've got gaps or where we've fallen behind, and here's some ideas about what we think we need to be putting in place to fix it. What do you think? And that typically is a public consultation, Eddie. So that's the sort of thing that goes out on the government's consultation hub. People can reply, and then all of that is taken away and looked at. And then there will be usually some more work, at which point you try and distill what you're going to do and then turn it into drafting instructions, which is the bit where you take the idea and the policy principles and say, now to our legislative drafters, can you write it in a way that works legally, that will turn into a piece of legislation? And MHKs are always involved, because to make any law, if it's primary law, it has to go through the branches of Tynwald, so it will go through the House of Keys, and then it will go through the Legislative Council. If it's secondary law, which is sort of sometimes more detailed law that we have to bring in to give full effect to something, that will go through Tynwald. So the politicians are always involved, because in the end, that's one of our primary functions is as legislators. So I hope that helps.
Okay, Eddie?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, really, because the second part of my main question is, the government are intending at the moment to put turbines on shore, and to do so, we as a group up in Erestane realise that they're going to have to change as many as 7 different laws in order to do so. So we've got existing laws already that would say, no, you can't do it, but they're going to have to change all these. And these are laws which have taken years and years and years.
What sort of laws, Eddie?
Well, the very first one, which is very topical over and over again, is the hen harriers. You're not allowed to go near a hen harrier, touch its nest, disturb it, so on. You're not allowed to damage the heathland. You're not allowed to cut trees down. The animals, the insects, the flood risks. so on. I mean, I'm very concerned about the flood risk. Now, if you or if health and safety on the Isle of Man know that it will create a flood risk, surely it shouldn't go ahead straight away.
Okay,
but
all right.
You will have to change all the laws to make this happen.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll put that to the Home Affairs. Jane Poole-Wilson?
So, Eddie, as I understand it, as with any new infrastructure, there are processes that have to be followed. And one of the key processes is an environmental impact assessment. So I think it's through that type of process where you take into account all the potential environmental impacts that assessments are made as to whether or not a particular piece of infrastructure is going to get, for want of a better word, clearance or approval under that process. And then even when an environmental impact assessment has been completed, there is also the planning process. And the planning process is a really interesting process because it has to balance off a whole range of policies and requirements in terms of assessing whether or not a particular planning application can proceed or not. So those processes have to be followed through, looking at all the relevant policies and legislation that apply.
Okay, a final word, Eddie.
Yeah, it's as simple as that, really. I mean, when you said there the planning will have to balance things, but surely planning will have to follow the laws as they exist or go to you to actually have them changed.
Eddie, I mean, planning already has to balance, if you like, a series of factors with any planning application that comes forward. And those, you mentioned flood risk, but sometimes it can be traffic implications. And there are a whole, if you look at our strategic plan, our planning legislation and all the policies and so on that sit underneath and around that, there are a raft of things that the process has to take into account. So you don't necessarily have to change any of them. You just have to know that the planning process follows the law, and part of following the law is looking at all the relevant factors and policies before reaching a decision.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Eddie. We're good to hear from you. We're stacked up with calls on Mannin Line today, but there's one first I just want to come to. It's a message in from Bev, and she was saying, could you ask the Minister just to clarify, and it can be as short as you want on this, because she said the legislation's nowhere near done. You were talking about hate speech and hate crimes. And Bev just says, surely hate is a subjective term. How can you make it objective? I.e., how can you have a point in law beyond which it becomes hate? Who decides?
Well, I think the issue is where what is happening is motivated by a particular factor. So, for example, where there's an assault or there's some sort of activity that is clearly targeted against someone for a personal characteristic that goes beyond what you might say is not motivated by a person's particular characteristic, that's what would be different. Right. But that's exactly why there's a process around policy consideration, consultation, and then careful drafting.
Okay, Mark's with us now. Hi, Mark. You're live with Home Affairs today.
Yeah, hi, Andy. Hi, Home Affairs. I just wanted to know whether there's any intention, either directly or indirectly, to introduce ID checks on our ports via the steam packet, because, and if not, why not? And because at the moment we basically don't know who's over here, and it's only a matter of time that something happens. And I'd just be interested to know if something does happen, and you don't know who that individual is. Would the current situation be good? Yeah, sorry, I waffled there a bit, Andy. That's my question.
Okay, we got it.
Thanks, Mark, for your question. I think your question speaks to something that is a priority for Home Affairs and Government in the current year, which is to look at our borders and make sure that our port security is enhanced, and we are acting to, one, try and dissuade anyone with a criminal purpose from bringing their activities to the Isle of Man, but then also detect them should they try and do that. So as part of that, we've actually developed a series of actions, and we are planning to publish in the coming weeks, I think probably in September, later in September, a sort of overarching strategy that talks to all of these factors. And yes, looking at what a proportionate way to consider how we better understand who is travelling to and from the Isle of Man is part of our focus. It's part of the constabulary's focus, and it's part of wider government's focus.
What's your main concern, Mark?
Well, basically, we don't know who's coming to the Isle of Man, and that was a fantastic speech and very waffly, Jane, and really good. But at the end of the day, you get on a plane, any jurisdiction, there's an ID check. On the steam packet, there's no ID check. We don't know who's coming to the Isle of Man. And, you talked about reducing criminality, fantastic, but a simple measure is to introduce ID checks. And there was a lot of spin and there was a lot of waffle there, Jane, to be honest. But I think at the end of the day, until you do that, you simply don't know who's coming to the Isle of Man. And I would suggest this is a political decision, but I would imagine the police would be very much in favour of this. And I heard through the grapevine that one of the main reasons is that if people want to come to and from the Isle of Man with regards to, if they, from a tax point of view, it's easy to do it on the steam pack. And I actually trialled this as a matter of interest because when you key the steam packet in, I put a false name and address. And when I booked a ticket, and I got a ticket and I got into the steam packet. So I just wanted to test it. So that's a bit precarious and a bit dangerous, if you don't mind me saying.
Mark, I agree with you. And I think the other thing that's interesting from an emergency planning perspective is if something were to go wrong and we were to have an emergency at sea, it's also important we have verified passenger lists so that we can identify anyone who's a victim of that. So I'm sorry if you found it waffly, but I was trying to say that there are a raft of things, and looking at improved identification and verification is one of those actions.
Okay, now Davies?
It's also not correct to say that all airlines require ID to travel. They don't. So they require it in some cases as part of their terms and conditions, but they don't all automatically require verified ID. So it's a complex situation because we sit within the common travel area, which allows free movement between the constituent parts of the United Kingdom, including the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. But it is certainly something that the Constabulary are keen to see. I think we've identified it as a significant risk to keeping the island safe, and it is something that the department is considering as part of an overall plan to keep the island safe and to ensure that those who come to the Isle of Man to commit crime are kept away. Excuse me, kept away from our shores.
Just to add, you're actually incorrect there. When you're checking in luggage, you have to show your ID, and that's an airline policy. So you could do it indirectly via the steam packet. So at the moment, somebody could get on the steam packet, check luggage in with no ID, have a gun in their suitcase, and come to the Isle of Man. So you're incorrect. If you check a bag in, you have to give ID, and you can do that via EasyJet. If you're not checking your bag in, then you don't have to give ID, just to correct you there.
Okay, all right. So are there metal detectors at the sea terminal, Jane Poole-Wilson?
That's an operational matter. I believe they do undertake certain security checks of people when they bring their hand luggage in. But I think the issue isn't really related to luggage. And I think I said before in response to your point that it's not entirely correct to say that airlines always require ID. They don't always require ID. But I think the point is actually it's not necessarily about detecting things in luggage. It's more about detecting the people who come here to either bring drugs or import other contraband to the Isle of Man, and then the people who leave the Isle of Man with cash in particular. That's a significant area of criminality, but also in terms of people, whether people might be being trafficked to the Isle of Man for other purposes. So it is an issue that we're aware of, and it is something that I think will have to be fixed with legislation if the government intends to bring it in at some point, and if the policy supports that. So it is something we're aware of, and I think we're working closely with the Constabulary to bring a suite of measures forward which will keep our island safer.
Okay, all right, Mark, we appreciate that. Thanks for calling.
Oh, blowing a hoolie out there.
Come in for a bravig by the fire. Just stocked up at Hearth. Never been so warm.
Who's that? Hearth?
Aye, they've got kiln-dried hardwood for me log burner, Colombian coal and smokeless ovals for the open fire, kindling and firelighters all delivered. Great value too.
All goes up the chimney anyway, so I pay more. I'll be giving Hearth a call.
Check their website as well. Just order and they deliver.
For all your fire fuel needs, call Hearth on 560 577 or visit hearth.co.com.
We interrupt this broadcast to inform all our listeners about the huge range of bathrooms and showers on display at Pacesetter. Yes, you all know that Pacesetter is known as the island's largest tile store, but I'm here to tell you that their bathroom displays are truly inspirational. Visit Pacesetter on Harris Terrace, where you'll discover a fabulous collection of stylish bathrooms. There's something to suit everyone, with design available. Pacesetter bathrooms and showers to show off about.
When you need a fitting memorial or headstone for a loved one, contact Manx Memorials in Peel. This long-standing family-run Manx company offer a wide range of granite and marble headstones and memorials, along with an island-wide inscription and renovation service. Manx Memorials skilled professionals will take the time to help you choose a suitable memorial, and we're proud to say we'll beat other local quotes. Call 843 861 or email matthew@manxmemorials.co.uk.
Want to know what makes you feel like this?
You get such a buzz if you've never done it. You can just imagine having your very first ice cream or your very first chocolate bar. That's what it's like.
It's like feeling freedom. It's just like, wow, this is what I've dreamt of. It's the best.
That first lap, I came back in and I was like, I'm not doing anything else. If I don't do anything else in life, I've succeeded.
Yeah, it was just mind-blowing. Everything I thought it was going to be and more.
Find the Journey to a Dream podcast brought to you by Kawasaki Insurance at motorsport.manxradio.com or from your favourite podcast provider.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
Jane Poole-Wilson, MHK's here, and Dan Davies, Chief Officer for Justice and Home Affairs. A message in now, this is for Peter, who was just saying, is the department happy with progress that's being made at the prison, Jane Poole-Wilson?
Yes, I'm glad that's come up, actually, Andy. There have been a lot of challenges at the prison, actually, but I am very pleased with the work the prison has been undertaking. As listeners may be aware, we had an inspection and there were a number of actions arising out of that, and we've obviously had the recent findings from the inquests into deaths in custody, and a lot of work had already been progressed around that because we've called in the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman as well to offer an independent view and further advice. So a lot of hard work has been undertaken and some significant changes made. There is still more work to do, but I'm really pleased with all the staff and the governor and the way they have worked so hard. And I have to say as well, the staff in the Department for Home Affairs who work very closely with the prison to support them in all of that work. So it's a work in progress, but I think so far I am pleased with how things are progressing.
Okay, is the prison full, Dan?
It's close to capacity, yes.
And the mobile cells, are they in yet?
Yeah, they are. They're in place. They've been risk assessed. They've gone through all the necessary checks, and they are starting to make them operational, mainly for low risk prisoners who go into the community to do work and come back. So they are operational, and they are helping to address the capacity issues currently within the prison.
Okay, Stephen, hi. You're live with Jane Poole-Wilson and Dan Davies.
Hi there, guests, and good afternoon, listeners. I would just like to say I hope that more ID checks are not introduced on the island. We do live in the common travel area, which gives us free and unhindered travel in this area. I don't want to make light of the terrible tragedies that have happened both in European areas and in the UK. ID hasn't helped one little bit. These tragedies have still happened, unfortunately. It's a false narrative to suggest that they will keep us safer from people who are intending to do us harm. So that, I think, should be nailed once and for all. It's not a panacea to do this. You don't have ID for people who get on a train between Edinburgh and London, for example, or travel between counties. So I do think and hope that you will not try to introduce ID controls. I know that your department, the police, would probably like us all to have badges on us of who we are. but to go to an extreme. But that's not how it should be.
That's an interesting point, Stephen. I just wonder, pardon me for interrupting, but Dan Davies and Jane Poole-Wilson, what Stephen talks about is, I'm going to paraphrase and correct me if I'm wrong, but keeping it Manx. You know, the Manx people don't seem to like to be overburdened with legislation and things like that. How do you tread the line between keeping it safe and keeping it Manx, if it were?
And I think it's an important point, actually, that whenever you make changes which are designed to look after the safety of this island and its people, it's about doing it in a proportionate way. Because yes, Stephen's right, and it came up in the previous call that we are in the common travel area, and so we have to be mindful of the freedom of movement, if you like, or the ease of movement between the different parts of the common travel area in any way that we approach things. But I think what we're also aware of, and it is a very recent rise in what we're seeing in terms of organised criminals targeting the Isle of Man. And of course, the easier it is, the more porous our borders are, then we're an attractive place to bring criminality. And I think it is about trying to balance the need to try and keep all of us safe and, protect our quality of life, which is also about keeping it Manx. Our quality of life on this island is hugely significant, and our relative safety to other parts of the British Isles. So it's a proportionate approach that we need to take.
I do apologise for interrupting, Stephen. Carry on.
Well, I believe you can use any excuse or example to introduce more draconian legislation. It does seem to be what you do or what you want to do. The authoritarian systems never really find a solution. There's nothing wrong with using intelligence-led policing to avoid the criminality, but some of the things require broader discussion and political decision-making. You are assuming that everybody supports your draconian legislation on cannabis, for example, and yet in the UK now, cannabis is virtually a non-criminal offence. It's hardly enforced by various police forces. So you have got to think at some stage, do we have to have a different approach rather than an authoritarian approach? I do think that you're missing a trick. You're not looking at the whole picture. Some people happen to like and take recreational drugs. I do not. I like a glass of wine, but a lot of people would say that's a drug in itself. So you're using some examples which are not really current to the modern world.
Stephen, I think your point about wider drugs policy is an interesting one, because actually Home Affairs commissioned a review into the harms caused by illicit drugs last year, and we're going to be bringing forward some principles for debate in Tynwald shortly, which are about what the island's overall policy approach should be around things like different drugs, including cannabis, because I think it is recognised that there are changes in people's approach to different drugs, but when we talk about the criminality associated with it, I think there's a distinction, isn't there, between an individual who may choose to take a certain drug for recreational purposes, even though it's currently against the law, if we're talking about cannabis, and there's these serious and organised criminals who will, deploy really quite significant methods to exploit vulnerable people, but also bring criminality to the Isle of Man. And it's that latter part that I think we have to be mindful of the impacts of that for the safety of the island, whilst also engaging with society, as you've said, around actually if there are changes in what society thinks or how society thinks we should approach the general use of drugs, a drug like cannabis, then we need to consider that and consider what the right policy approaches are from a criminal justice perspective, but also from things like a health, public health and education perspective as well.
Okay, final word, Stephen.
Well, I don't think we're going to agree on this particular subject. You're there representing the constabulary who want these extra regulations put in. Whether you're adopting a political stance for that, I do not know. It's certainly not something that I support. I want a completely free society as we've got now, without these extra regulations. The regulations only affect honest people. And I do not think that by introducing an authoritarian approach is a solution. You've got a prison that's full to capacity, probably full of people who've been convicted of drug offences, and you need to have a bigger, wider discussion on this problem.
Okay, all right, Stephen, I'm sorry, we've got to go. We're out of time. We have to go, but we appreciate it. Finally, Dan Davis, briefly, you were going to say?
I think Ireland's within the common travel area, and you still have to present ID to travel to Ireland, so it's not without precedent.
Okay, lots more we didn't get to, so hopefully we'll do this again, possibly before Christmas. Thanks for being with us today. Thanks, Jane Poole-Wilson, appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy.
Good to talk to you, and Dan Davis as well.
Thank you, Andy.
All right, good to hear from you. We're back with an open line tomorrow, so if you want to follow up on anything you've heard, by all means, do get in touch. The answer phone's on 682-631 or email manninline@manxradio.com. Thanks to Howie Kane on the phones today.
WINT. Imagine a future where the Isle of Man is powered by the very wind that shapes our shores. Ørsted are a global leader in renewable energy and are bringing more Mannin, the island's first offshore wind farm, to life. It's a chance for secure, renewable energy, new local jobs and a boost to our economy. But we need your voice. Public consultation is now open until Wednesday the 11th of September. Visit orsted.im to explore our plans and share your feedback. Let's create a world that runs entirely on green energy.